Hi, welcome to Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 4 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of and author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and you want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on my Substack or support me on Patreon. I will have those links in the comment section. The website will also be in the description section. So, I'm a little late today. We have some breaking news relevant to one of the 3 articles that I wrote this week. The first article this week, which is again most relevant, was some breaking news happening right now. Israel strikes Iran diplomatic compound in Syria. And then the other article was 2 bilateral and 1 trilateral summit involving more matters in the South China Sea, and 2 approaches to restart peace talks over the Ukraine war. One of my favorite ongoing subjects of how that war is progressing and the mysterious reason why there's no urgency to seek peace talks. So we will start with the first article this week. Israel strikes Iranian diplomatic compound in Syria. This is where we're seeing breaking news today. As we're going through recording as of now, Iran has launched roughly 100 drones at Israel. No damage has been assessed yet. Iron Dome and the multi-layer defense of Israel, and also the U.S. has claimed they have shot some of the Iranian drones down. Don't know anything about his Israeli response. Not sure how to evaluate this attack yet. They definitely, meaning the Iranians, telegraphed this attack. Launched drones from inside Iran to attack inside Israel. This is a first of its type, highly escalatory, but also the fact that they use drones and so far not using ballistic missiles and not getting Hezbollah involved in the attack. This is seems very telegraphed to me. Be interesting to see how this goes, what the Israeli response will be to this. So I will be checking throughout this podcast to see if there's any updates and maybe give you some of my more thoughts as I kind of go through some of my views, summary of the unscripted of what this first paper was. And all I could say right now is I was wrong. As of this morning, I did not think that Iran would risk attacking Israel directly, that they would use proxies instead. I was wrong on that. I was watching a number of analysts today talking about that 60% of them or so, 65% of them did not think Iran would strike Israel directly. They would do something, but not attacking Israel directly. They thought it was too escalatory. They've talked about, for example, General Keane. I think he was on Fox News and one other network. He was saying that he believed that the Iranians would not do this as well. Another, I'm not sure what his name was, said that the Iranians tend to be, they might say provocative statements, but are very, they are not ones to jump off the, let's say jump off the deep end and launch an attack of something of this magnitude. So apparently many of us will be wrong. We'll hear more about it on the Sunday shows, maybe find out some more tonight, more about Israeli response. Again, seems interesting that they telegraphed this so far in advance. The Israelis had hours to prepare for this. So you would think that if they were that Iran was really serious about it, they would have coordinated the attack with, at the time the drones were arriving, that ballistic missiles would be arriving at the same time, try to overwhelm Iron Dome. But again, more will come, breaking news. All I can do is speculate from what I see right now. But let's talk about what actually caused all this attack to occur. So Israeli fighter bombers attacked the Iranian consulate building, not the main embassy, but a consulate building in Damascus on April 1st, 2024. Some say this was basically a military headquarters, but under the guise of a diplomatic compound to give them some form of diplomatic immunity. Also, it is escalatory for other countries to attack other countries' embassies, regardless of the country. So, obviously, this was a provocative attack by the Israelis, even if the Iranians were using this was a military compound, but again, it was a diplomatic compound as well. The airstrike killed 13 people, including 2 brigadier generals, Brigadier General Mohammed Reza Zahidi, the commander of the Quds Force, and his deputy commander, I'm going to butcher this name, Brigadier General Hadi Hariramhimi, were killed. So the top 2 leaders of the Quds Force in Syria have been killed. These were the highest ranking generals killed since the U.S. killed Soleimani in Baghdad airport back during President Trump's administration. So the Quds Force they specialize in intelligence and non-conventional warfare, and is one of the 5 branches of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. That is made up of the ground forces, the air forces, the navy, what's called the Basij. I probably mispronounced that as well, which is a paramilitary volunteer militia in the Quds Force. The Iranian Republican Guard Corps is constitutionally mandated to protect the Islamic Republic, not to protect the state of Iran. So the Islamic Republic, so unlike the army, which is to protect the sovereignty of the country, the Iranian Republican Guards is to protect the Islamic Republic and, by extension, the Islamic Revolution. So something very much like what you see in, for example, when you talk about China. We'll use that example here, is the PLA, People's Liberation Army, is not China's national army, is the army for the party. So Val is very much like that. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is in addition to the army. So I know this gets overused a lot, but we could also look at it, the difference between the Wehrmacht in Germany and the SS in Germany was one was for the party, one was for the state, but they worked together. That's kind of what you see with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, not trying to make any alignments between the SS and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, though I don't have a lot of respect for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, but I don't want to sit there and make this just another cheesy comparison of Nazi Germany to whoever, because we see too much of that here in domestic politics here in the U.S. Also, 5 additional Iranian officers were killed. They assumed that these were also part of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. And then 6 non-Iranian military advisors that were aligned with the proxy groups that are fighting, that are supported by Iranians and fighting Israel in this unconventional warfare. So here's where I missed it. I said I did not think that Iran would want to directly attack the U.S. or Israel due to the risk of Iranians' Ayatollahs losing power with a restive population. So this is where I did miss this. Because first off, the Iranians threatened the U.S., said that they blamed us for the attack. Even in late this week, they were blaming the U.S. for playing a role in the attack, and they did warn the U.S. not to get involved and to, quote, stand aside, end quote, from getting involved in protecting Israel. So this is where I got it wrong. So, and I'm not the only one, so, but, sometimes you got to eat one, so I did here. Iran has promised to, again, retaliate against the U.S. and Israel of the attack, and that they did. They did that tonight. So, again, more to come. So I thought the most likely option was to use the proxy forces, mainly Hezbollah, to attack northern Israel. Hezbollah is probably the most powerful Iranian militia group that has a border with Israel, certainly more powerful than Hamas, even before Hamas has been battered in the Gaza Strip. There is at least 50,000 fighters for Hezbollah in Lebanon and somewhat in Syria, but mainly in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah is also a political party in the Lebanese government. So they are not only a proxy force, but they are also a political party, and they're one and the same. It's not something they share names, but this is the same organization that holds power in the government and also is a proxy force. They do have 50,000 fighters. It is said that they could pull up to 100,000 fighters in to go to war against the Israelis. But most alarmingly, they have 150,000 rockets, mainly provided by the Iranians. These aren't ballistic missiles, but just rockets that can fire at different ranges all the way. My understanding, they can fire most of northern Israel. I think most of the major cities of Jerusalem, Haifa, and Tel Aviv are barely within range, and probably most of these rockets. So this is mainly a threat to northern Israel. Some rockets this much, if they were able to fire this many rockets, it would overwhelm the Iron Dome system in Israel. So the one thing that Hezbollah has been threatening to enter the war, but they have been relatively reserved. They fire occasionally rocket attacks and do some cross-border incursions since the Hamas attack out of Gaza. The results is that 600,000 Israelis in northern Israel have been displaced due to the area attacks of Hezbollah rockets. These are not precision rockets. These are area attacks. So what they're going for on the Hezbollah side is looking to attack civilians to try to inflict the maximum amount of casualties. When say displaced, a lot of these people are still in the same area, my understanding. Not necessarily homeless, but living close to or in bomb shelters to stay somewhat protected. Also, the Israeli army, the IDF, Israeli Defense Force, has moved some civilians out of the border region. And so they have been displaced. Now, fewer Lebanese in southern Lebanon are displaced due to Israeli attacks, and counterattacks are directly at Hezbollah sites and airstrikes in Beirut and in Syria. This is just a different nature of the technology. Israelis have much more precision weapons, so they do not have to go for area attacks. Less likely to try to attack civilians just to create civilian casualties. I know that's a touchy subject, but Israel, obviously, when you look at what they're doing in southern Lebanon, they are not looking to attack Lebanese civilians. There are a lot of Lebanese Christians in southern Lebanon, but for the most part, the reason why there's fewer displaced Lebanese than there are Israelis is due to the nature of the responses from the Israeli side. Iran, this is an option. This could still come up with these attacks that have just occurred tonight, could have Hezbollah unleash a large-scale rocket attack on northern Israel and use its 50,000 and maybe additional 100,000 fighters to launch attacks into Israel and draw Israel to attack southern Lebanon. Obviously, there is some history in Israel crossing into southern Lebanon several times, including ejecting the PLO out of Beirut in the 80s. Again, I think they attacked into the 90s or early 2000s. So Israel has not hesitated to go into southern Lebanon, but they could say that they've had mixed success going there. So I think they would prefer to have the Hezbollah pull back 30 miles from the border and not have to go in there. But Hezbollah has not withdrawn so far. So this is a threat that is still laying or still leaning on Israel right now. So it's on their mind. They definitely have to keep a large amount of Israeli forces in the area to keep in case they do attack. And I imagine that this current attack that's going on tonight, they're probably on alert as well. Also, the other option is Iran could respond in the same way that Israel did and attack embassies. So Israel attacked the complex, consulate complex in the Iranian embassy in Damascus, Syria. So maybe the Quds force would attack in kind. That doesn't seem to be the case right now, but then again, that could follow on later. So this is definitely rolling out, or this is still something that's still in progress. And then one thing is Iran has warned, this is what I said earlier, told the U.S. to stand aside or face Iranian retaliation. The U.S.-Israeli relations are at a low point over the war in Gaza, mainly around southern Gaza and the city of Rafah, and the humanitarian issue that's going on there. So there's a lot of also domestic politics in play here and some international politics. President Biden is no friend of Benjamin Netanyahu, and neither was Barack Obama. So there is some ill will towards there, and for the most part, Netanyahu is not a fan of President Biden or President Obama because of both those U.S. presidents have been wanting to get back into, or in the case of Obama, sign the Iranian nuclear deal, which Israel was very much opposed to. So there's a lot of bad blood. So it would seem that most likely the U.S. would not be willing to intervene in this war, and not like when October 7th attack happened, the U.S. deployed the Gerald Ford aircraft carrier battle group to the eastern Mediterranean to deter Iran and Hezbollah from trying to widen the war. I did not think that because the Israeli relations with the U.S. is at a low point, I did not think that the U.S. would not abandon Israel, but I didn't think they would send an aircraft carrier battle group to the eastern Med to warn away Hezbollah. And mixed review on that one. They are sending a Marine expeditionary force with 2 destroyers and the USS Bataan, I think, with 2,500 Marines into the Eastern Med. But the destroyers have a capability to shoot down missiles, but I don't think they were in position yet. And then also you had the USS Eisenhower aircraft carrier battle group in the Red Sea, which was not in a position to dissuade Hezbollah. So mixed area around there is that the U.S. did deploy assets, but they basically intercede themselves between the Houthis operating out of the Red Sea, who would also launch attacks to Israel, and they have through drones. So, but not putting the U.S. in way of trying to prevent a Hezbollah attack in northern Israel, southern Lebanon. So still kind of a mixed bag of what the U.S. was doing. I don't know the strategy of keeping the USS Eisenhower in the Red Sea instead of into the Eastern Med. It, again, most likely has to do around the operations against the Houthis and trying to cover southern Israel from drone attacks coming from that direction. Also, there is that ongoing shipping, trying to keep the shipping channels open. So there is a need for an aircraft carrier or a naval presence in that area. So more to come. Let me take a brief look to make sure all hell hasn't broken loose yet since I've been talking. Headlines coming from Fox News. U.S. military shoots down at least dozens, quote, of Iranian drones launched at Israel. Also, Iran tells the U.S. to stay away. So, nothing about casualties. Iran did say they launched some ballistic missiles, but I have not seen anything coming up from that. Also, not sure where the U.S. shot down Iranian drones, if it came from the Eastern Med, or if it came from the Red Sea, or was there some other air assets. The U.S. has been moving some assets into the area, mainly through the Air Force. So we'll check more on that as we go on through the night. Okay, so the other paper this week was called 2 Bilateral, 1 Trilateral Summit. And this is a summit that occurred this week between the U.S., Japan, and Philippines that in Washington, D.C. This was actually 2 summits, and maybe you can actually say 3. It was U.S. and Japan meeting on Wednesday, the U.S. and the Philippines meeting on Thursday, and then later on Thursday, the the Philippines president joined the meeting. All right, sorry about that. There was some noise out, so we are going to continue on about the two bilateral summits between the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines. One thing, starting on the summit, I think probably just to put an explanation point at this, was the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines and Australia all held a joint naval exercise in the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone, or the EEZ, on the week of April 7th. It's part of what's called the Australia, Japan, Philippines, and United States Maritime Cooperative Activity. It is something that has been in place since November 2023. This particular exercise included 6 surface ships and 4 aircraft from the navies. This was not a Coast Guard exercise. This was a naval exercise. So this was, let's not say as coincidentally, but this happened this same week as the summits were supposed to take place in Washington, D.C. So this was more of a message to China by picking this particular exercise. China sees the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, their leadership in Beijing sees these joint patrols and the summit. This has gained the attention of China, and China calls these provocations and are destabilizing to the region. Typical Chinese statements about what goes on in the South China Sea, that they claim, again, going in there through the 9-dash line, they claim the entire South China Sea. They claim parts of the East China Sea as well. They have dubious legal claims to this. And most, the UN and the Maritime Court has said that the Chinese claims are illegal, and most of the world backs this down, but China doesn't care, and they claim that this is the South China Sea is sovereign territory to them, and that any of these violations are destabilizing and a provocation to China. So the bilateral summit, which China, again, they hate, they don't like any countries. In fact, they've warned countries in the region not to hold any type of summits with outside parties. China basically dictates the terms. They say they are the owners of the South China Sea, and that if any country has a dispute or wants to negotiate the particulars of China's claims, they have to be done as bilateral with China. Do not bring any third parties into the conversation. So the fact that this is going on with mainly Japan and the Philippines having ongoing disputes, territorial disputes with China, this has got the Chinese attention. The first one is a bilateral summit between the Japan and the U.S. in Washington on Wednesday, and it's focusing on defense issues around China and North Korea. The Japanese are in the midst of doing some changes to their defense orientation, and the long signed U.S.-Japan security treaty is just being updated to accommodate these changes by the Japanese as far as their defense orientations. So one thing that Japan's running into is they have to change their defense strategies, because one thing they run into is they need to address the aggressive China and North Korea. And North Korea has done many provocations, mainly through missile tests and shooting missiles over Japan, but also threatening Japan with nuclear weapons. So most issues are obviously around China, but there is a North Korean element that has to be monitored as well. They need to adopt to changes in warfare, not only due to changes in military technologies, but changes in contested domains past the traditional air, sea, and land, which includes cyber and probably in the area of intelligence gathering, space. So some of those are the areas that they've had to make updates to their defense treaty, and that's one of the things that they're doing is to become more capable in some of the areas that the U.S. has been a dominant factor in. The final is driving the updates is due to Japan changing its military strategy to improve capabilities and readiness. like the Colt, like many in the West, and that we've seen that's going on with the war in Ukraine, where the West had their peace dividend. The Japanese, after the fall of the Soviet Union and a relatively quiet China, or not as aggressive China, they allowed their military to fall somewhat in decay, maybe not to the extent that the Europeans did, but they certainly did not keep up with their defense spending, and they spent their peace dividend as well. So they're going in through their improving their capabilities and readiness, because the fact is, this has happened under the prior two Japanese prime minister. Is Japan's becoming more assertive? They're realizing that they have to, and with the U.S. support, that they need to become more assertive and protecting the interests inside their domain in the Western Pacific. So expect the Japanese to move away from their World War II enshrined pacifist orientation to one that is more aggressive. For example, there was a number of articles released about some of the improvements to Japanese destroyers, which were actually, they could usually fly just helicopters. They were classified as destroyers and not aircraft carriers. Looks like they're going to be redesignated as aircraft carriers, as now they can carry the F-35B Lightning, which is the vertical takeoff version of the F-35, and they've started taking deliveries, and they have ships that are going to be capable of handling those. They had to reinforce the flight decks to handle the jet blast and the heavier weight of the F-35s versus helicopters. They also made the decks larger to accommodate more aircraft. So this is a case where you're seeing Japan move away from that pacifist orientation, where they're getting to the point that they're creating what they're willing to call aircraft carriers. In fact, they're actually taking these destroyers that are going to be redesignated are actually taking names of World War II aircraft carriers. So this is where you're seeing Japan become more assertive in the region. That is certainly something that China did not want to see. The other goal from this bilateral meeting is for Japan to join the Advanced Capabilities Partnership of the AUKUS Security Pact. AUKUS is Australia, United Kingdom, and U.S. It's a security pact. The part that is not in it, that's going to be counted in this, or not going to be on the table right now, is there will not be a full partnership for Japan in AUKUS. This is just for the Advanced Capabilities Partnership. The existing partners of AUKUS especially the U.S., wants Japan to join, but the three partners do agree that Japan needs to do more improvements in both cyber and intelligence security, which is one of those domains that they're working on in their security or their defense readiness updates that they're going through and negotiating the security pact with the U.S. with. So that's something that will probably come in the future. I don't want to say the near future, but you'll probably see more discussions on that. Advanced capabilities. So what is that of the AUKUS Accord? It's advanced capabilities as part of the AUKUS Pillar 2 goal, which was, I think, signed in December 2020. It uses a lot of buzzwords, talk about promoting industry and innovation sectors of the economies of the member countries, Australia, United Kingdom, U.S., and now wanting Japan to join this, including joint projects where you're going to see U.S., Australia, and United Kingdom, in this case Japan as well, working on the same projects together. You'll see Japanese engineers working in U.S. defense plants, and vice versa, Australians, British. So you're going to see a lot more working together in unison. And the idea behind this is to create advanced weapons with a faster turnaround time than what is traditionally seen in the defense sector. So the idea is to make more capable weapons that are transformative, though I imagine most of them are going to be incremental, though you could certainly see something like hypersonic missiles coming on board, work with lasers for drones, so on and so forth. But the idea is that they want to be able to take defense and some of these more innovative sectors, probably some of your technology sectors that chips, with computer chips, maybe with computer technology, robotics possibly, because obviously you're seeing drones becoming more advanced. You're probably going to see U.S. is running a 6th-generation fighter that will have a combination of manned fighters and drones that are controlled by the manned fighters, stuff like that. So you're going to see some of this incremental and transformative military technologies, or that's the goal, and to be able to field these much quicker than was expected. So, for example, how long it takes something to come from drawing board to fielding as a operational fighter, for example, F-22, I think that took almost 15 years from the time it was on the drawing board to the time that it was actually started being deployed, and maybe even longer than that. The famous F-14 Tomcat was actually flew in Vietnam as a very first prototype. A lot of people don't realize that. So that's how long it takes to get these, what you look as advanced technologies, takes the better part of 2 decades to get them from drawing board to deployed as active units. The idea behind the AUKUS Pillar 2 advanced capabilities is to be able to create these technologies, upgrade these technologies both incrementally and transformatively, and have these deployed in much quicker time periods. They're not saying if it's going to be turned around 5 years, 10 years, I'm not sure. There's being very quiet on that. But that's one of the things in Japan, being a very innovative country in both technology, computer chips, robotics, could certainly be a valuable partner in this. And the idea is too is this is to stay ahead of the China's military buildup. Is maybe that these countries, the U.S. is trying to form alliances in the Pacific, and the idea is that they're probably not going to be able to meet the Chinese numbers, very much like the Soviet and the West, where they had numbers, we had technology, the West had technology. It's probably looking at the same thing, but trying to be able to get it to in service and in the field faster than what we've seen in the past. So that is well on its way. And probably a good move from the point of view from the Japanese. I probably have always been somewhat, again, definitely a U.S. person, but the Japanese have always been interest to me because they've always been good anti-communists, even in World War II, which when we were fighting them. And then the other summit is the trilateral summit between the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines. And U.S., obviously, we had the Philippines as a colony after the Spanish-American War, and the Filipinos fought an insurgency with us over that. I won't go into the history of it, but Filipinos are tough, stubborn people. The Japanese had learned that. We learned that. And I guess now the Chinese are learning how stubborn the Filipinos can be. So this is a summit that that the Philippines really wanted to pull together. Obviously, Japan and U.S. do have concerns, but Philippines have been in a direct line of fire, water cannon fire, more than anything else, ramming of ships in the Second Thomas Shoal. And so the Philippines are in an interesting position where they're not, it's hard for China to project force there. So trying to become a real military threat to the Philippines is difficult for China to project force that far because it goes away from their mainland, most of their mainland air cover. They don't have an active aircraft carrier fleet that has the capabilities of the U.S. or against ground-based fighters that they'll be found in Guam and the Philippines. Also, the Philippines have the one thing that the Chinese do not like, and the Philippines remind them, they have a defense treaty with the United States. If China wants to start a war with the Philippines over the Second Thomas Shoal, it will most likely bring the U.S. into the war. And a war in the Philippines with the Chinese is not a fight the Chinese want. The Filipinos know that. So they're going in there. They're signing alliances. They're having bilateral and trilateral meetings, and they are directly countering the Chinese claims in the South China Sea. So the Philippines are pushing all the buttons with the Chinese right now. So also, Japan and the U.S. have their own separate defense pact in this trilateral meeting, and also the Philippines and the U.S. have one, and Japan and the Philippines have a defense treaty. Originally, it was a more, probably not as ironclad as the U.S.-Philippine treaty or the Japanese-U.S. treaty, but is a form of cooperation between Japan and the Philippines, where it was originally for economic development and has moved into security issues, as both the Philippines and Japan have common security interests in the Western Pacific. So the Japanese and the Philippines have been working well together. You're seeing the agreements to allow the stationing of troops on each other's territory between the two countries, and you're starting to see willingness of the Japanese selling military upgrades to the Philippines to help them with their ongoing issues, mainly against China, and make them a more capable military force. So what we're running into in the South China Sea and the Second Thomas Shoal is the challenges of the free navigation that both typical traditional naval powers believe in. That's the U.S., Japan, United Kingdom, for example, Australia, where international waterways to keep it open for free trade. Where the opposite is true with China, who claims South China Sea is their sovereign territory, and you have to have their permission to pass through it. South China Sea, number of countries are in there. Japan's not in the South China Sea, but they are in the East China Sea, and there's another dispute with China over the Senkaku Islands. So that's where Japan gets pulled into this, kind of melds into the South China Sea issue. So where the U.S., Japan, Philippines want free navigation in the South China Sea, which you're seeing 60% of all international trade passes through the South China Sea, including energy going up through the South China Sea, through the Taiwan Straits to Japan, coming from the Gulf states. So this is definitely an important route to Japan as well, versus China, who claims it as sovereign territory. So the Philippines need help in that they need more deterrence against China, mainly around that their claims right now in the Second Thomas Shoals around their beached old World War II ship that was beached or grounded called the Sierra Madre, as a way of having a manned claim in the Second Thomas Shoal, which is in the Spratly Islands. Spratly Islands, of course, are claimed by China as part of the Nine Dash Line. So the Philippines keep a manned presence. This ups their claim in the area, and this is where most of these clashes with China are coming from. So they are looking at asking for help from the U.S., and Japan and the international community, Australia, for example, stepping up patrols in this area, because at some point the Sierra Madre will probably have to be abandoned, and that will remove the manned claim. So the Philippines need to find a way to strengthen their position in the Second Thomas Shoal, so that they can keep their manned claim in that area. If they have to abandon Sierra Madre, most likely the Chinese will move in, and it will be harder to remove the Chinese, just like Japan has the same issue. The Chinese decide to move into the Senkaku Islands. It becomes a law enforcement activity than a military activity, especially if the Chinese Coast Guard or the Chinese Maritime Militia is involved, instead of the naval force and the Chinese Navy and their Marines landing on the Second Thomas Shoal. That would kind of hit into the warfare area. If the Chinese Coast Guard and Maritime Militia, it becomes more of a law enforcement function. So the Philippines don't want to deal with that. So they need help to deter the Chinese away from the Second Thomas Shoals, because one thing you run into with the Sierra Madre is it needs to be repaired. The Chinese put up a pretty big show of it by trying to keep the Philippines away from resupplying using the water cannons, ramming. So the Philippines are obviously not going to have time to repair the Sierra Madre, so that's why it's most likely have to be abandoned. So they need to come up with a new security pact that ups the gives more capability in that area, and that's why you saw the patrols this week. So it's this trilateral meeting is more of a Filipino strategy and a U.S. strategy to try to coordinate to frustrate China, but it really serves in the Filipino interest, which in this case the Filipino interest is in the U.S. and the Japanese interest. So they just kind of reached that point where we're all working in the same goal, and maybe we didn't, meaning we, the Japan, Philippines, and the U.S. did not get there in the same path, but they all got there to the same goal, and that's to deter the Chinese away from the Second Thomas Shoal. So one thing you're looking at is that most likely it seems to indicate that Japan might actually take the lead on this and the U.S. playing secondary. So you might start seeing the Japanese Coast Guard, which has bigger ships than the Chinese Coast Guard, or the actual Navy, like the patrol that's happening right now in the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. Those are Navy ships, so much more capable than the smaller Chinese Coast Guard ships, which is what the Chinese right now rely on to certify their claims in the South China Sea. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. The other one that was funny was China complains about this block being formed between this summit between the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines, while at the same time they're meeting with the Russian foreign minister to reaffirm their cooperation with the Russians. So it's okay for them to have blocks. It's not okay for anybody else to have blocks. So it was just kind of funny to see typical Chinese speaking on both sides of their mouth. They want what's good for them and not good for them. They have no standards. It's whatever is good for China, and whatever China wants, China announces. So it's more to come on this one, but this is not the direction where the Chinese go, and not sure that the U.S. and Japan want a clash with China. But I think they're trying to find a way that they can deter China away from these islands and help the Philippines. So more to come on that. Obviously, it seems like every week, every other week, there's something going on in the Second Thomas Shoal. So more to come on that. All right, my favorite topic, the Ukraine peace. So there's two approaches, the name of the paper, 2 approaches to restart peace talks over Ukraine war. It was expected that over the winter, that peace talks would largely stall because they didn't think that after the failure of the spring and summer offensive, it was generally agreed that the Russians would keep up the pressure through the winter. Basically, now that the typical is that the offensive switches over from the Ukraine side back over to the Russian side. So they agree that the Russians were going to not even seek any type of negotiated settlement in the war through the winter. They were being resupplied by large amounts of artillery and missiles from North Korea, lesser extent from Iran. And there was also a presidential election over the winter in Russia where, shock of shocks, Putin was reelected. So it was generally not agreed that there would not be any peace talks over the winter, and there weren't. There were some negotiations with Turkey, trying to restart them, and Turkey did hold some negotiations between both Zelensky of Ukraine and Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia. So there has been some low-level stuff, but nothing was expected to break through. So on late Wednesday night and Thursday morning of April 11th, the Russians launched a large-scale strike of 40 missiles and 40 drones against the power infrastructure in Ukraine, as a retaliation for the attacks that Ukraine has done against the Russian petroleum facilities. What we're running into is that a lot of these missile tracks, they start going towards Poland, and then they veer off. Sometimes they don't successfully veer off because there has been cases where errant missiles have landed in Poland. This strike put Poland on alert. They launched fighter aircraft. They put their air defense system on alert. Obviously, if Poland does it, which is part of NATO, they're on the Russian frontier. Obviously, that's set an alert within NATO as well. So it goes in a case where there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of risk that when you have two armed forces facing off each other, though they're not directly involved in the war, there's a lot of animosity because obviously NATO countries are supporting Ukraine, and a lot of NATO states in the East are concerned about Russia being overly aggressive. So there's a lot of nervous people, and then people in leadership. When you've got a shooting war going on and you're so close to each other's border, it doesn't take much to create an international incident. And this is the danger of just keeping this war going on and on and on. If we don't want this war, being as the West, we say, for example, the war in Gaza, there's been peace talks the whole time. Almost from the start, there's been trying to negotiate for hostages, trying to find a way for ceasefires, trying to find a way out. There's almost no lack of urgency on the international community, at least any of the major powers, to start peace talks. They kind of talk about it, but nobody's really committed to it. So the one country that's been fairly upfront about it has been Turkey, and we'll get back to them. So you come in there and say, you have these countries, we're sitting there firing missiles, Poland's going on alert, NATO's going on alert. All it takes is one incident, and all of a sudden you can cross into a shooting war. Is that going to happen? Most likely, I'll say no. But as the war goes on and on and on, those risks become higher. Maybe one minor incident happens, but there's 5 or 6 others that were ignored, and basically the last one broke the camel's back, and before you know it, you find yourself in a war or at least an international incident. So the war going on, the risks get higher and higher for where we want to go. So currently the war is stalemated. Now, stalemate means that maybe that they're not, where they're equally matched and nobody's getting the advantage. It's more of a stalemate in that either side doesn't have an incentive to seek a general offensive to capture large swaths of territory. That's mainly what's meant by a stalemate. The Russians, for their part, have not indicated any desire to push deeper into Ukraine, because now you're running out of the Russian influenced areas into areas that are truly Ukrainian. Obviously, Russia and Ukraine, they've got a history from the Soviet Union. Also, a lot of those border regions between Ukraine and Russia, you see a lot of Russian, either a large minority or even a majority versus Ukraine. So if the Russians push deeper into Ukraine, they will be running into areas where it's going to be dominated by Ukrainian people that are not going to make it any easier for the Russians. So it's not in the Russians necessarily interest to overrun larger parts of Ukraine. Maybe there's a military reason for Kiev, but for the most part, they have no desire to push deeper into Ukraine. Mostly they're interested in straightening their lines and maybe seek to capture some strategic locations close to the front lines that maybe threaten to open up, that if the Russians get the upper hand, they could advance deeper into the Ukraine and threaten Ukraine's existence. That could set up a situation where maybe the Ukrainians have to come to the peace table or face major Russian advances. So maybe those are some of the things that the Russians will look for, and they will be relying very much on wearing down Ukrainians. They will use lots of artillery, very much like the Soviet doctrine, and you're going to see mainly fixed fortifications and taking those and trying to put pressure on those cities within and cities and geographic locations that are strategic. The Ukrainians, on the other side, are being pressed by the West and their supporters to stay on the strategic defensive this year and prevent any Russians from gaining those strategic points along the front line. The Ukrainians have issues right now with pulling up more soldiers. That's still being debated, how they're going to go up and doing call-ups. Their current soldiers, they're not letting them demobilize, even if they've been in service for a number of years. They're just going to keep them at the front line, or at least in the military. So Ukrainians are need to husband their strength, start collecting resources from the West that have slowed down, and basically be able to fight a defensive war and try to wear the Russians down. So it's not expected to have any significant movements in the front. And right now, also, they're kind of in the mud season or coming out of the mud season. It's very common, and people read about wars in Russia, Ukraine. That area is there's cross-country movement. Again, I'm talking about off the hard roads, but cross-country movement is hard to do. It's very muddy, very wet, hard to move supplies. Maybe tracked vehicles can move across, but not anything else. Hard for the infantry. So this has typically become an area that the fighting naturally slows down because no significant movement can be done. Plus, you have two sides that don't really want to make significant movements. So it seems like this is a good time to start peace talks when there's no sense of urgency that an offensive is about to start. Excuse me. So what we run into here is that there's some peace efforts on the table, and though the chances are slim, maybe this is the time to really push to get an answer of why can't we have a peace? Why can't we find a breakthrough to end this war? So there's two peace efforts. Back during the World Economic Forum in January of 2024, Switzerland and officials and Ukrainian officials met with other leaders that were attending Davos, the World Economic Forum in Davos. Excuse me. The Ukrainians presented their peace plan, their 10-point peace plan, and the Swiss agreed that they would hold peace talks. Well, Switzerland agreed announced this week that they would be holding peace talks in June, and the original concept was that the Zelensky's 10-point peace plan, which to me is a completely ridiculous peace plan. It's not a peace plan at all. It's almost like a wish list and a lot of buzzwords to try to make people in the West happy. So it's not really even a blueprint for peace. You're seeing that the Ukrainians the Swiss are not inviting the Russians to the peace summit. So how can the Russians say, well, how can you have a peace summit if one party's not involved? And they have a point. But then the Ukrainians fall back on a position saying constitutionally we can't negotiate directly with the Russians. I find that actually kind of ridiculous, because if you have to talk to the Russians to end the war, at some point you're going to have to talk to them. So the 10-point peace plan, I'm going to read it off briefly to kind of see some of the ridiculous points, because I always refer to it as a ridiculous peace plan. First is radiation and nuclear safety, which is over around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It's under Russian control right now in the Russian-occupied Ukraine. Ukraine says that this needs to be turned over to International Atomic Energy Agency. Ukrainian personnel need to be able to run it, and it needs to be reconnected to the Ukraine power grid. So behind Russian lines, and they're trying to tell them that the Russians have to do this. Number two, food security, such as the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This is important both to Ukraine and it is important to the world. A lot of grain does pass through the Black Sea to parts of Africa. For example, there is food in Egypt is very expensive and it's causing a lot of pressure in society. They get a lot of wheat from Ukraine. So this is where it does play into it. This is where it's a case where this does help the Ukrainians because they're able to sell their wheat, but also this is kind of a play to the UN saying, hey, we just want to sell our wheat to a world in need, which you can argue that they are in need. So this doesn't seem so much for the Ukrainian persons, especially because Ukraine has found a way to move their grain without moving too far into the Black Sea, basically by hugging the coast of Romania all the way to Turkey and then out the Black Sea. So they have actually found a way to deliver their wheat, or they move it across the land. They basically move it to Romania, and then it gets moved over across the land into Europe, and then from there it ports in Europe. So they've kind of worked their way around this. So this seems like kind of a unnecessary demand. Energy security. Russia needs to stop attacking the energy grid. So they're going into this is to talk to the European audience, because Ukraine just wants to sell their electricity to the West. This is really meant for the Western audience, especially when you're seeing that they're taking a pretty significant beating because they've basically been cut off from Russian gas and oil. So doesn't really seem like energy is something that the Ukrainians can even export right now. They have energy issues on their own because the Russians are beating up the energy grid pretty extensively, and this was even before those cruise missiles and ballistic missiles were launched at the Ukrainian power grid. The Russians have purposely targeted the power and energy sector of Ukraine, especially going into the winter, just to make life hard on the Ukrainian civilians. Return of prisoners and deportees, that seems fairly innocuous, probably, of course. But usually that's usually something that goes on in peace treaties. So no real issue with that one. United Nations Charter, this is number 5, United Nations Charter for Ukraine, territorial integrity, restoration of international law, and the 2014 border. So obviously 2014 is when Russians moved in and took Crimea and started helping occupy parts of the Donbass. Number 6, end hostilities and Russian troops withdraw from Ukraine 2014 territory. Number 7, justice, special tribunal for Russian atrocities. Number 8, immediate protection of the environment, damage to the forest and laying of landmines and collecting up landmines. Important issues, but seems like something that would be negotiated later on. But prevention of escalation, addressing Ukraine's security needs such as NATO and the EU partnerships, and then confirmation of the end of the war. So this is what Ukraine wants. You notice there's nothing in here that's involves any type of compromise to Russia. And of course, obviously, when you go in there and you put your cards on the table, you want your wish list for peace talks. But the Ukrainians are sticking to this peace plan, and which seems like their partners in the West would have said something to them about this, that this is no way to exit or to start negotiations. They say also that Russians have to 100% evacuate 2014 Ukrainian territory before any negotiations and implementation of the 10-point peace plan. Fortunately, these aspirational goals and not really a blueprint for peace, Switzerland has decided to back off this. They may play lip service to it, but I think they realize that this is not really a way to start peace talks. And they're right on that. By contrast, Turkish proposal was submitted to both Russia and Ukraine this week, and it has not been outright rejected, where, for example, the Russians, rightfully so, have rejected the 10-point peace plan. They said they will not be dictated to. And no, regardless of what you see, just if you go in there and take a neutral point of view, you can understand that the Russians, in their strong position within Ukraine, which I do believe they wrongly invaded. They don't belong there, but they are in a strong military position. And for Ukraine to sit there and say you have to leave before we can even negotiate seems kind of ridiculous. The Turkish are taking a much more realistic approach to it, and that's really saying something when you're talking about Erdogan. President Erdogan of Turkey is the grown up in the room. That's really saying something in the world. So fortunately, the Russians and the Ukrainians have not rejected it. I think the chances are slim are that they will accept this, but I think this is a viable peace plan, at least to be discussed, or at least make the backbone of it. And this is actually very similar to a 2022 peace plan they had. The first part is a commitment of the U.S. and Russia not to use nuclear weapons under any circumstances and resume the provisions of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START, and add a provision that neither party can unilaterally withdraw. This goes back to there's a lot of tensions between the U.S. and Russia prior to the war, where both countries had started violating provisions of START, and in the end, both of them withdrew from the START treaty. This was something that was basically reduced the nuclear weapons, if I remember correctly, by 2/3 on both sides, negotiated at the end of the Cold War, or towards the end of the Cold War. Both parties have, both Russia and the U.S. have basically withdrawn themselves from this. The idea is with Turkey is, hey, you guys got back in this treaty. It was working, and you both don't need to be getting out of it. So it's kind of addressing that, hey, there's bigger issues than just Ukraine here. So I think that's probably a realistic approach of Turkey. Probably some details obviously have to be worked out of it. All parties agree not to interfere in the affairs of either country or attempt to destabilize their governments. This kind of goes back to the Budapest Memorandum, concerns about security, is both the U.S. and Russia have been interfering in the internal affairs of the Ukraine. So, which is something the Ukrainians were concerned about when they signed the Budapest Memorandum during Bill Clinton's administration. So the idea is that, hey, you've got to treat Ukraine as a legitimate government to basically manage their own affairs without interference from West, mainly the U.S., and East, Russia. All parties agree not to interfere with the internal affairs of either countries. Sorry, I read that part again. Armistice along the current front lines. Okay, obviously there's going to be some areas that have to be negotiated. I can't see Ukraine agreeing to give up all this territory. Can't see Russia giving up all this territory. The idea is, hey, just stop the fighting. Don't move any farther than where you're at now, and just stay in the current front lines. The idea is just we're in a stalemate situation now. Just stop the fighting. So that's probably the difference between a armistice and a ceasefire versus a peace treaty. This is the idea of an armistice. Stop fighting. We'll negotiate everything once the fighting stops. Have an internationally monitored referendum in 2040 in the Ukraine territory occupied by the Russians, Crimea and the Donbass for the most part, and let the residents in each of these territories self-determine their future. Most likely you're going to see these will probably go back to Russia. These are Russian majority areas, and they will probably vote Russian. Now, maybe there's ways that they divide up parts of the Donbass. Maybe they say, okay, we were going to have districts along the Ukraine border, districts along the Russian border. These are all details to work out. And maybe only part of the region goes to Ukraine and only part of it goes to Russia. So that's, again, negotiation points in there. Because, for example, let's say in this particular Donbass area, 60% of the western part of the Donbass is Ukrainian and 40% Russian. But then when you go into the eastern part of the Donbass, maybe it's 65% Russian and 35% Ukrainian. So there might be something where they divide the whole area to bring some level of stability, and it will probably be based around the border regions. That's my personal opinion, but this is probably a fair compromise. Wait till 2040 and then let the people decide where they want to go. Ukraine agrees to stay non-aligned until at least 2040. NATO expansion was a big part of what caused the Russians to go to war, along with the mistrust building up with the West and around the START treaty. So this is probably a good idea. Exchange all prisoners of war. This actually aligns with Zelensky's 10-point peace plan. And also the people that were forcibly removed from Ukrainian territory have to be returned. Also, Russia cannot object to Ukraine joining the European Union. I've said this before, is if your goal is to impoverish and leave the Ukrainians poor and destitute, yes, they cannot join Russia and they cannot join the European Union. And they will get no help from anybody except maybe the United States. But the idea here is Russia and Ukraine are forever divorced. Russian aid is not going to be sought by the Ukrainians, and nor will the Russians most likely willing to give aid to Ukraine unless there's like some high level, like some pretty big stipulations. So I say at this point, these two are forever divorced. If you want a strong, stable Ukraine that can at least somewhat prosper, I know they've got issues with corruption, both government and industrial. That's things that EU is working on. That's part of their EU somewhere. Before you become EU, you have to do these certain steps to eliminate corruption. This is really the only future for Ukraine, is joining the European Union, and the Russians should not be allowed to object to it. Now, joining the European Union requires 100% agreement by all member nations. That's where the fight's going to be, but Russia should not be allowed to object. And this is where I agree with Turkey on this one. This seems like a no-brainer. Again, this only has a small chance for success, but this is a viable blueprint for peace. These details will require a lot of negotiations, but it also requires many parties to be involved, because this war ostensibly is not about Ukraine and Russia. This is about disagreements between East and West. And Ukraine was the pawn used by both sides, in my opinion. So multiple parties have to be involved. This is not just Ukraine negotiating. This is not just Russia negotiating or Russia-Ukraine negotiating. This is all partners involved in this, because all partners put us here. So a comprehensive peace involving the United States cannot get in a room with Russia and dictate terms about what a Ukrainian peace looks like. Ukraine has to be in that room. The U.S. has to be in the room. Russia has to be in the room. Probably the members of the European Union, either as independent countries or as a bloc, they need to be in that room negotiating. You could probably say Turkey needs to be involved, because they're in that border region as well, along the Black Sea. So again, very little prospect for success, because the major powers aren't interested in pursuing peace. And so the question is, why don't they want to pursue peace? They're okay pursuing peace when it comes to Gaza, but they're not okay with pursuing peace in Ukraine, when the Ukraine war has been going on we're in our third year, 2 complete years. The Gaza war hasn't gone on for 6 months. The 30,000 or so Palestinians have been killed, according to Hamas's numbers. Take that with a grain of salt, but obviously there's been large casualties. You're looking at the area, as I think Victor Davis Hampton said, we're moving from Verdun territory to Battle of Somme territory in World War I. When you're talking about casualties, you're talking about casualties that are approaching 1 million between both sides. This is much, much bigger than Hamas. So why doesn't anybody want to pursue a peace to end this war? So it really makes the question is, why? So one of the excuses they come up there is, well, Russia and Ukraine have distrust with each other. Well, excuse my language, but no shit. They have a problem. They have a lack of trust in the other. They went to war. The fact that you went to war means you have some type of distrust with each other. So what's the reason for this? and you really have to press is if the U.S., the European Union, Russia, Ukraine are not seeking peace, the publics in the West, because you're probably not going to get it from Russia, they need to push these parties. Why don't you want a peace? And if they sit there and say, well, there's too much distrust between the other, and we have to continue fighting. Well, okay. What's your war aim then? What do you want to do? There's got to be a purpose behind this. And nobody's pressing them on this because as rights of the citizens, whether you believe in the Ukraine side, and I do believe that the Ukrainians were, Russia did not need to invade Ukraine, but they did to make a point. The West obviously pushed this by playing with the idea of expanding into Ukraine with NATO and obviously interfering in the affairs of Ukraine to kick out pro-Russian elements in the governments there. So obviously both parties were playing with each other. So this wasn't about the war. So what are the war aims? If the publics in the West and Ukraine are paying for this war, whether through money and treasure or through lives, probably the world deserves to know what are we doing here? What are we attempting? What's the war aims? It can't all be about Ukraine. It's all, well, Ukraine's fighting for democracy and survival. Okay, but that's not what got us there. It wasn't because Russia was mad at Ukraine. It was bringing in Western policy there. What is the purpose of this going to war? What is the war aims? People deserve to know, and nobody's pressing on that question. And the fact that they're not pressing on the question should be telling in itself. So that's my rant, is that at some point you have to negotiate, and they're not going to negotiate. If the major powers are not going to get involved in this piece, then the public needs to push why. Why don't you want to seek peace? And what is your aim to keep doing this? And it can't be fighting for Putin bad man, and we're standing up for democracy in a country right now that doesn't even hold elections, has outlawed many political parties, and the Russian Orthodox Church. So, and suspended habeas corpus. So, okay, I don't know how democratic that is. We had an election during World War II, during the Korean War. So obviously you can have elections in the middle of a war. Not saying it's easy. I think Iraq had a election when we were U.S. occupation in the middle of a insurgency. It's possible to do. So I think that's more to come on that one, but it really starts to wonder, why aren't we seeking a peace? And those questions need to be asked. They need to be pressed. So one excuse comes up with is, by not deflecting and not answering a question, is, well, Putin, the president of Russia, is waiting until the 2024 U.S. elections to decide for peace. Partisan politicos think this is because Putin wants to embarrass Biden, much in the way of Iran did to Carter over Reagan, where they held on to those hostages all the way to the point that Reagan was sworn in as president, and then those hostages were put on a plane and sent over just to embarrass Jimmy Carter all the way to the end. Or Putin thinks he'll get favorable treatment from Trump if he gets elected, but this is doubtful. You know, he didn't invade Ukraine when Trump was president. So I don't know where he thinks he's going to get favorable treatment. And if you remember, go recalling back in 2014 when the Russians took over Crimea, they asked about the idea within the West, they say, are you going to arm Ukraine? And the typical response from the Western Europeans and the U.S. was, they were not going to send weapons. We will send non-lethal aid, non-lethal military aid to Ukraine, but not lethal aid. So there was no sending of weapons or anything but like that, but sending them equipment like uniforms and helmets, and I think the Germans sent helmets and sent uniforms and blankets and food, like MREs, stuff like that, backpacks, but we weren't sending lethal aid. I know that President Trump got impeached over the idea of sending lethal aid to Ukraine over that phone call, which take it as it might, but the U.S. under President Trump was starting to send lethal aid to Ukraine. So the idea of this call that somehow Trump's going to be favorable to the Russians doesn't really hold up when you start looking at the facts that happened after 2014 between giving the Ukrainians lethal aid of who wouldn't give lethal aid to Ukraine and those who would give lethal aid to the Ukraine. So those are some questions that need to be answered. Not saying that President Trump was going to flow in tons of arms, but he was willing to flow in arms that you did not see from his predecessor. Now, the other part is President Trump on several occasions, he doesn't advertise it too much, but he says that he's come up with a peace plan, pretty vague and typical President Trump style, but he does understand how to bring people to the negotiating table. And he probably does have some goodwill with both countries. Maybe more so with the Russians because Ukrainians are skeptical of President Trump. You'll go into some of the election politics of 2020 involved in that as well. But he will go in there he won't go in there with the baggage that the current administration is holding over. So you're going to see in this case is President Trump's going to offer, he says, if you don't accept my peace deal, or at least come to the table to have a peace deal based on my terms, which again, he will be flexible because again, he knows how to negotiate. If the Russians reject it, he said he will arm the Ukrainians to the teeth. And again, he was the one that proposed more lethal aid to be sent to the Ukrainians than any of the other prior administrations. So this really seems like just political partners in the U.S. elections trying to make up something, and not necessarily what Putin is thinking. So it's really unsure what Putin is thinking, but I don't think he thinks 2024 is the magical bullet that will help determine the election unless he wants to embarrass Biden. And Biden and Obama with Putin did not necessarily get along either. Oftentimes Putin embarrassed him, especially Syria red line, where President Obama drew a red line, and the Syrians kept crossing it. And basically they asked the Secretary of State at the time, John Kerry, asked the Russians to get involved in Syria. And that's pretty much all we wrote in going on with Syria. And we kind of go into what we were talking about today with the Iranians and all that. So lots to go into how things are interconnected with each other. But we won't go into that part. We'll talk for 4 hours on that. So the other one is the French proposal to send NATO troops to Ukraine, or if not NATO, specifically troops from NATO countries not acting under the banner of NATO going to Ukraine. This was originally brought with shock, like what, and U.S. and Germany have rejected this idea, but it's starting to get some traction. And when I said earlier, all it takes is one international incident when you're shooting missiles close to the NATO frontier, bad things could happen. So all it takes is one bad thing, and all of a sudden a bunch of NATO countries say, yeah, we're going to go ahead and send troops to Ukraine. Is this what the Russians really want to risk? Is this what the world community wants to risk? So again, the longer you wait for peace and you're right there shooting in a shooting war along the NATO-Russian frontier, there is a chance that something could go wrong. Do you want to continue that chance? Does Putin want to take that chance? Maybe. Does the U.S. and the West want to take that chance? Maybe. But it goes back in the idea of what's the war aims? What are we trying to do here? So it brings in a lot of questions about that. So again, all it takes is one international incident to all of a sudden more NATO countries will send troops to Ukraine, and then all of a sudden they can be in the line of fire, even if their idea is that they're just going to be there to help build factories. They're going to be in the line of fire. And what happens when the first NATO troop gets killed? Or even, call it French troop, who's a NATO country, gets killed. What happens then? So waiting till the end of 2024, November 2024 or January 2025 is probably not really what's in everybody's mind. It sounds more like the Politico talking, tying in election politics with what's going on in Ukraine. So hopefully we'll get some traction in the peace talks. Hopefully we'll find a way out of this war, and maybe some settlement will come up, or if nothing else, maybe we'll find out what is everybody's war aim so that everybody knows what is actually at play here. Sometimes things just don't run that clean in international community. So that kind of goes into today's discussion. So we will look at quick look at the news, see if anything's changed. So the U.S. says Iran fired both ballistic and land attack cruise missiles at Israel, I guess in addition to drones. So that's something. That was from Fox News. And nothing really coming from Mail Online. Let's take one quick look at some of the major wires. Reuters. Iran launches retaliatory attack on Israel with hundreds of drones and missiles. So now they've added, Iran launched 200 drones and missiles, not 100, 200, in a retaliatory attack. Hamas rejects Israel's ceasefire response and sticks to its main demands. Again, that's the Iranians talking there as well. So, more to come. It'll be interesting to see how this goes throughout the night and see if there will be an Israeli response. So, thank you for sticking with me for this last over hour. I will say again, if you like my content and you want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on my Substack or support me on Patreon. I am also at Pegasus Research on Rumble and on YouTube, where I do some video summaries, so I can get on their video services. I do some video summaries. I write scripts that have to be that make videos that are about 3 minutes in duration. That is a summary of my papers. Sometimes they add a little dramatic twist to them. So again, I take my paper and I write scripts for it, and then video. It's artificial intelligence creates video. It's just so I can get on a platform. But it's a quick, easy way if you don't want to take time to read my papers, which take about, they try to be relatively short, take 6-7 minutes of reading time, takes about 8 or 9 minutes of me reading them, because every paper I do an audio version the next day. But if you don't want to do that, go off to Pegasus Research on either YouTube or Rumble, and you can see a shorter video version, a dramatic video version that's usually just about 3 minutes long. That will at least get you the gist of what's going on with my papers. So again, thank you for listening in today, and there will be more updates, I'm sure, as we see what's going on with this attack in Israel, and see if there will be an Israeli response. Thank you again. Links will be in the descriptions, and until next week, thank you.